I walked into my backyard that morning, and for a second my brain refused to process what I was seeing because the tall green trees that had been there for years were gone, completely gone, just stumps. Broken branches scattered across the ground, like something violent had happened overnight. And the silence felt wrong, like the space itself knew something was missing. And right there, I realized this was not an accident, this was intentional, and someone had decided they had the right to erase something that never belonged to them, and what they did next cost them $1.4 million and their land. So before we go further, make sure you like and subscribe to HOA Revenge Files, because see, this story starts crazy and only gets more intense as it unfolds. Those trees were not just decoration. They were part of why I bought that property in the first place. Tall, mature trees giving privac. Why shade and a sense of calm that you cannot recreate overnight. And anyone who understands property value knows trees like that are not replaceable in any short time frame. They take years, sometimes decades to grow, and they change the entire feel of a home. I stood there, trying to make sense of it. And then I noticed the tire tracks along the side of the yard, and that told me everything. This was not random. This was planned equipment, had been brought in and used with purpose, which meant someone oved it, or at least believed they had the authority to do it. And that is when one name came to mind. Immediately, Karen had been complaining for months about the trees blocking her view. She lived slightly uphill, and from her angle, my backyard trees limited what she could see. And she had made comments about it before, always framed like suggestions, but with a tone that felt more like expectations. And I had always responded politely, explaining that the trees were fully within my property line and protected under local guidelines. I took a deep breath and walked the entire boundary, checking every dump, every cut, every mark, and the more I looked, the clearer it became. This was not some quick job. This was a full removal done by professionals, which meant someone had spent money to make this happen. And that raised a bigger question: who gave them permission to enter my property and do this? Later that day, I received a message from the HOA stating that landscaping adjustments had been made to improve community aesthetics and views. And when I read that line, I actually laughed for a second, because it was so disconnected from reality. They were calling the destruction of my trees an improvement, and that is when I knew this situation was about to go much further than they expected. I responded, asking for clarification, and specifically requested documentation showing any authority they believed they had to remove trees from private property, and I attached my own documents showing property boundary, rise surveys, and local protections for mature trees, because once something like this happens, it is no longer a simple disagreement. It becomes a matter of rights and responsibility. The reply I got was vague and defensive. They referenced community standards and visual harmony, but provided no actual legal basis for the action, and that told me everything I needed to know. They acted first, and were now trying to justify it after the fact, which is always a dangerous position to be, and I decided not to rush anything, and instead I started gathering everything: photos from before and after, records of the trees, estimates of their value, and reports from professionals who could assess the loss, because this was not just about appearance. This was about measurable damage, and once you start putting numbers on that kind of loss, the situation changes quickly. Neighbors began to notice too, and conversations started happening. People were asking what happened, and when they saw the before pictures compared to current state, the reaction was the same across the board: shock and disbelief. Because even those who cared about views understood that crossing into someone else's property to remove trees was not a small step. Karen eventually approached me, acting like the outcome was justified. She talked about improved visibility and how the neighborhood looked more open now, and I listened without interrupting, because sometimes the best thing you can do is let someone fully explain their position. And when finished, I simply told her that what was done was not just wrong, it was going to have consequences. And I meant that in a calm, clear way, without raising my voice, because the facts were already strong enough. I brought in an arborist to evaluate the damage, and the report came back detailed and direct. The trees were mature, healthy, and added significant value to the property. Their removal caused both immediate loss and long-term impact, and the estimated cost was not small. It was substantial enough to turn this into a serious legal matter. At the same time, I reviewed the HOA guidelines line by line, And there was nothing that gave them authority to remove trees from private land, especially without owner consent. And that gap between what they did and what they were allowed to do became the center of everything. I filed the necessary claims, and once the process started, it became clear very quickly that this was not going to be dismissed or minimized because the documentation was solid. The evidence, Seki, was clear, and the actions taken against my property were undeniable, and that is when the tone from the HOA began to change. Communication became more careful, less confident, like they were realizing the weight of what had happened and trying to figure out how to manage it. But at that point, it was no longer something that could be handled with simple messages or explanations. The situation had moved into a space where accountability mattered as everything moved forward. I stayed focused on fact. Not emotion, because reactions fade, but documentation stays, and every step I took was built on that idea, keeping everything organized, clear, and backed by proof. Because once you do that, the outcome starts shaping itself without needing force. What started as a complaint about a view had turned into meeting far more serious, and the people who believed they could make that decision without consequence were now facing a reality they had not prepared for, and the process that followed would change just the outcome of this situation, but how decisions were made in that entire community moving forward. As the process moved forward, the difference in tone became impossible to ignore, because the same people who had once acted with competence were now choosing their words carefully and responding slower. Like they understood that every statement mattered and every detail could be questioned, and that shift alone told me the situation had already gone further than they expected. The formal evaluation of the damage carried real weight, because it was not just my opinion anymore. It was a professional assessment backed by numbers and standards, and when those numbers were presented, the scale of the loss became clear in a way that could not be dismissed. The trees were not only part of landscape, they added measurable value to the property, and their removal created a financial impact that had to be addressed at the same time. The question of responsibility became central, because was not a natural event. This was a deliberate action taken without permission, and that meant someone had to answer for it. And once that question is asked in a structured setting, the answers have to be supported, not assumed. The HOA tried to shift the focus toward community benefit, talking about improved views and overall appearance, but that argument did not hold when placed next to documented property boundaries and the lack of authority to enter and alter private land, because preference not override ownership, and that principle stayed at the center of everything. Karen stayed involved, but her approach changed. The confidence was gone, replaced by a more cautious presence, like she understood that pushing further could make things worse, and that change reflected what was happening across the board, because once the situation was fully visible, it was no longer something that could be controlled through opinion. Time passed, and each step added clarity. Reports were reviewed, tenants were compared, and the sequence of events was laid out in a way that showed exactly what had happened. And when you see everything lined up like that, the outcome starts to become predictable, because the facts lead in one direction. When the final decision came, it was direct and left no room for interpretation. The removal of the trees was determined to be unauthorized, and the impact significant enough to require full compensation. And when the amount was stated $1.4 million, it changed the atmosphere instantly, because that number represented more than money. It represented accountability for a decision that should never have been made. But the result did not stop at a payment structure, because the situation around the land itself became part of the resolution, and adjustments were made that shifted ownership boundaries in a way that reflected the scale of the damage and the responsibility tied to it. And that is how something that started with a complaint about a view ended with control of land changing hands. After that decision, everything became quiet in a different way, not the silence of uncertainty, but the calm that comes when a situation has been fully resolved, and there is nothing left to argue because the outcome is already defined and accepted. The neighborhood changed after that. People became more aware of boundaries, more careful with assumptions, and more respectful of the line between preference and rights. And that kind of shift does not come from small events. It comes from moments where actions meet consequences in a clear and undeniable way. Karen kept a lower profile after that, still present, but no longer leading conversations the same way, because once something like this happens, it stays with you not just as a memory, but as a reference point for future decisions, and it was clear that the experience had changed how she approached things. For me, the property felt different, not because of the loss alone, but because of what followed the space. Where the trees once stood was still open, but it carried a sense of closure, knowing that the situation had been handled properly and that the outcome matched the reality of what happened. Looking back, the most important part was staying steady from the beginning, not reacting too quickly. Not Lee. Letting frustration take control, but focusing on facts and letting those facts guide every step. Because when you do that, the process works in a way that supports you without needing anything extra. If you made it this far, I want to hear what you think. Would you have handled this the same way, or would you have taken a different approach? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every situation like this brings different perspectives, and it is always interesting to see how others would respond. And if you enjoy stories where actions have real consequences and where standing your ground leads to meaningful outcomes, make sure you follow HOA Revenge Files and share this story with someone who understands how important it is to protect what is yours, because sometimes one decision is all it takes to change everything.